Isn't it? This is a really exciting moment. And it all started with a tent. Now, the tent actually has a wonderful history. It was in George Washington's family. And Martha Washington, you know George had no children, Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, set it up on the grounds at Arlington where they lived, and he'd run boats across the Potomac River so that he could bring people over to see George Washington's tent and other artifacts from the war, and teach people. He had very much in mind teaching people about what had come before, not that long before, but before, and wanted to make sure that the next generations knew it. And then his daughter, Mary Custis, married Robert E. Lee, and there they were living at Arlington, and the Civil War breaks out. And the Lees, Mrs. Lee, left all of her great-grandfather's artifacts in the basement at Arlington under the protection of Selina Gray. Selina Gray was a slave, and Mary Lee trusted her with everything. And the Yankees arrived, and they started to desecrate anything that had anything to do with the Lees. And Selina Gray said, "Don't you dare." And she would not let them anywhere near George Washington's tent. And General McDowell finally got the word, brought the tent to the patent office in Washington, and there it stayed for many a year while the Lee family said, "It's ours. It actually belongs to us." And that fight went on for a good while until President McKinley finally gave the tent back to the Lees. And then Mary Custis Lee Jr., the daughter, decides that she really wants to sell it because she's established an old folks' home, an old ladies' home. And she needs the money to have the old ladies be able to live someplace. And so she sells the tent to Reverend Burke. But that's how Reverend Burke got the tent, and that's why we've got a big hole in the ground today. Now, I tell that story not just because it's interesting, which it is, but it's instructive about what this museum is going to do, which is to tell the stories. And that story that I've just told tells you the importance of women and an African American in preserving this history. And Mike has promised me that those stories will be told in this museum, because not only did women preserve our history, but they made our history, especially right here in Philadelphia. We can start with, in terms of the Revolution, Martha Washington coming here in the spring of 1776. She had already spent the first winter at camp in Cambridge, and it was the first of the 8 long winters she would spend at camp. I certainly hope that is in this museum. But she came here to get the smallpox vaccine, and that was an incredibly brave thing to do. If you didn't die from it, which a lot of people did, you then were probably protected against smallpox. And Washington was very eager for his soldiers to take the vaccine. But they were scared of it because people did die from it. So she came here. He didn't know she was doing it, Washington didn't, and got the vaccine. He was flabbergasted. But she did it partly to set an example for the soldiers, because, you know, he was then able to say, well, the girl did it, and you know, so it shamed them into doing it. But she also did it because she needed protection from the disease, because she knew that her fate was to be to spend all of the winters with the troops, and she hated it. It was terrifying. She suffered all the same privations they did. And she felt always that she was leaving behind her duty at Mount Vernon. But the general, as she called him, insisted that she come because she was so essential to troop morale. And you heard the governor quoting from 1776. David McCulloch gives great praise to Washington for keeping the troops together. But Washington would say he couldn't have done it without Martha and the other officers' wives who would come, and it was very dangerous. The roads were horrible. They were prime targets for hostage taking because the British were taking Patriot wives hostage and killing some of them. And of course, Martha Washington was the prime Patriot's wife. But they would come into camp, and she would arrive with foodstuffs and things that had been made over the summer at Mount Vernon. Again, another big contribution of African Americans to the Revolution. And she'd be cheered into camp. Lady Washington is here. And then she and the other officers' wives would cook for the soldiers, sew for the soldiers, pray with the soldiers, nurse the soldiers, put on great entertainments for them to keep up troop morale. And I must say it was a good thing she was on hand because George could be indiscreet. And there was one time in Morristown when he danced for 3 hours straight without sitting down with the very pretty and flirty Catherine Littlefield Greene, the wife of Nathaniel Greene, so it was good that Martha was on hand. She also did have a sense of humor, by the way. You never know it with that stupid little cap. But she named a tomcat Hamilton. I mean, perfect. But you know, in that winter at Valley Forge, which when I started doing research on the founding mothers, I realized that's basically all I knew about Martha Washington, was that she had spent that one winter at Valley Forge. I didn't know she had spent every winter of the 8 winters at camp. But actually, the Patriot wives who were at camp trying to keep the soldiers' spirits up are probably not the people that we owe the most to as a nation. But the Loyalist women who were here in Philadelphia, which the British were occupying. Now think about it. The British could have picked up at any moment, marched out to Valley Forge, decimated this freezing, starving, pathetic American army. But they were having way too good a time in Philadelphia. And in particular, we owe a debt of gratitude to Betsy Loring, who was occupying Sir William Howe, the leader of the British forces. And everyone knew it. There were little ditties in the newspapers, you know, Sir William, he, snug as a flea, lay all the time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. So, I would like to say that she did it out of patriotism. She did not. She got a good job for her husband in the British Army. And maybe she likes Sir William, I don't know. So they're not all our team stories. There is, of course, the infamous Peggy Shippen Arnold, who, you know, Benedict Arnold's wife, but she was in it from the beginning. She wrote in invisible ink between the lines to Major Andre, but she pulled the wool over George Washington's eyes, over Lafayette's eyes, over Hamilton's eyes. She was really pretty, and you know, got away with it until she got to England and they gave her a pension. But most of the stories of the women of Philadelphia really are fabulously patriotic stories. Whether it's Lydia Dara, you know, sewing coded messages to her son, behind her son's buttons, and sending him out to bring news of what the British were plotting because she was staying in the house with them, and out to the American army. Or my favorite of all, Esther Reed. Esther de Burt Reed was an English woman who married Joseph Reed, the first governor of Pennsylvania under American rule. They called it president at the time. You could be that, President Corbett would like that. So Susan says no. But she met Joseph in England where he was studying. And after, you know, her parents objected and everything, she finally got here, married. And she became a fierce fighter for independence long before those men meeting in Independence Hall were ready to to say, we declare independence, because she saw what was going on and she hated the fact that her country was doing this. So in October of '75, she said, we shall declare independence, in writing home to England. But in 1780, it was the really low point of the war. The British were occupying New York, they were occupying Charleston, the French had not yet arrived, no one was sure if they would, and the soldiers were threatening desertion by regiment. And she published, everybody woke up one June morning to this broadside, The Sentiments of an American Woman. And she called on the women of America to sacrifice their luxuries for the armies which defend our lives, our possessions, our liberty. And she organized a fundraising drive among the women of Philadelphia, and then wrote to the other first ladies in the other states. In fact, the only extant letter we have of Martha Jefferson's was one promoting the fundraising drive in Virginia when she was First Lady, because Thomas Jefferson burned her letters, another story. But Esther organized the women of Philadelphia. They appointed treasuresses. They kept meticulous records. And they marched out 2 by 2 all around the city and the environs. And just in Philadelphia, before they even got to the other states, they raised $300,000 in the course of a few weeks. And to tell you, to give you some sense of what that was, Robert Morris at the same time was trying to capitalize the bank, and he only raised $380,000. So it was a comparable amount of money. And in fact, one of the Loyalist women was so irritated by this, and she said, oh, people aren't giving them money because they believe in the cause. They're giving them money just to get rid of them, which has been a good fundraising technique ever since. But so they, Esther wanted the money to be used for something special for the soldiers. Not something that the army was supposed to give them, not food, not clothes. She wanted something special. And Washington was just horrified by this. And he kept saying, what they need is shirts. And she kept saying, no, why don't we give them some hard currency? Then they'll really, and he said, hard currency. First of all, they'll think that they should always get hard currency. And secondly, they'll drink it. And so they went back and forth. And finally her husband said, the general has so decided, so you have no choice left. You have to do shirts. She, who had not yet turned 34 years old, then died. Disease came through, in this case, dysentery. The council and assembly adjourned and attended her funeral in a body. And she lost the fight with George Washington. And Sarah Franklin Beige took over, and the women made the shirts. And a French traveler came through and saw them making them. They made 2,200 shirts, but the way to show the soldiers that it was something special from the women of America was that each woman sewed her own name into the shirt, so that the soldiers knew that this was a special thing for them from the women. And a letter from an officer at camp responding to this went out into newspapers up and down the states, saying that the soldiers who had felt neglected were pleased by this mark of respect. So it kept the army together and got us to the point where the war was won. But then, as you heard, then there was peace to be established. And that took a couple of more years. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris having a very nice time. And finally, and John Adams is writing back saying he's just partying, and John Jay finally sort of goes and gets stern. But finally we get the peace in 1783, and there's a country to raise, and that's much harder. That's a much harder thing to do. And George Washington really understood that. And he, finally, with the help of Madison and Hamilton, they convened this constitutional convention here. another reason why it's so incredibly appropriate for this museum to be right here. And it was a Philadelphia woman who was standing on the steps of Independence Hall when Franklin came out, and she said, "So what have you given us, a republic or a monarchy?" And he famously said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that woman was Eliza Powell. And the Powell House is around here also. But she became a very, very close friend of George Washington. And by the end of Washington's first term, the only thing that Hamilton and Madison could agree on, because the partisanship that we see today had already broken out. So the only thing they could agree on, like Senators Toomey and Casey could agree on this, is that Washington needed to run for a second term. That the country was way too fragile and way too regional for it to survive without him staying in place. And he wasn't going to do it. He had it. He had done his 8 years with the war. He had left Mount Vernon again to do the Constitutional Convention. When he did the Constitutional Convention and saw what the government was going to be, he knew he would be the first president, but he was done. The press was getting vicious, both to him and to Martha. The partisanship was making him crazy. He wanted to go home. And Madison begged him to stay, Hamilton begged him to stay, but they were self-interested. They had their own interest at heart. As late as November of 1792, before the December election, he went to Eliza Powell's house here in Philadelphia. And he said, "I'm not running again." And she said, "You have to. You absolutely have to." And he said, "I'm not doing it." And so she wrote him a letter that many people believe was the tipping point, where she called on his sense of duty, she called on his sense of history, she called on his sense of patriotism. But then, because it was a letter from a woman to a man, she also called on his sense of pride. And she said, "You are the only man in America that dares to do right on all public occasions. Your very figure is calculated to inspire respect and confidence in the people." He was a hunk. And no, he really was. And it worked. It worked. He ran again, and the country was saved. But the country was saved in large part because of the contributions of these women. And it is something important to tell that story along with all of the other really meaningful for the rest of our generations stories that will be told in this museum, in this city, so appropriately. So it is a glorious thing that we are celebrating today. And Jerry Lindfus, thank you so much for making it happen. And thank all of you for your support. It's going to be a great thing when it's up and built. Thank you.